There we go. It's Karaba. Okay, so I think I'm going to kick off in the meantime, and we will allow other people to enter the room as we go along. Like I said, I don't want us to be delayed or have any time constraints and run out of time for the presentation. So we are privileged to have with us this afternoon Grant Swanepoel. He is going to be talking on the topic of supply chain sustainability, a triple bottom line perspective. What can you expect from the session? Practical and risk-focused approach to the concept of sustainability in supply chain management. We have moved beyond just going green, but we now need to answer the question, how do we build supply chains that are robust, socially aware, environmentally responsible, and still contribute to business profitability? And that's a very good question. So I hope that we're going to get some answers from you there, Grant. Grant will also introduce the growing assessment and certification standards set for the ASCM-Enterprise, which offers organization a holistic and practical method to identify areas of opportunity in their supply chains. Grant, I am going to leave you to introduce yourself, except to say that Grant is a very passionate supply chain professional, a very close friend of SAPEX, and has been working very hard on many projects for the last 10 years. So for the rest of the introduction, Grant, I'm going to let you take it away. Thank you.
Tanya, thank you so much, and thank you to all the guests that have come for the session. I see there's quite a few people here, so that's really great. It's better to be sitting behind a computer than be sitting in front of a ton of people. I think it's less nerve-wracking that way. So thank you, Tanya, for that. Yes, SAPEX, and I go way back. In fact, I think about 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, I was at my first SAPEX conference as a student, and since then I was hooked. Obviously, since then, been doing supply chain consulting type work, demand planning, sales and operations planning, S&OP, and also supply chain optimization work. I've recently started a new business called Chainovation Africa, working alongside Chainovation, which is a global business, specifically focused around score-based transformation learning programs, as well as now bringing in the new ASCM-Enterprise, which I will be talking a little bit about today. So in terms of today's session, some of the things that I would like us to go through is, first of all, a view of supply chain flows and the new currencies that we find within supply chain management. Secondly, to look at supply chain sustainability motivators. So what are some of the reasons why companies want to go green or be more sustainable? And how do we link that then into more practical type of actions? Thirdly, I'd like to introduce the enterprise standards for sustainability. And I think some of you would have already heard a bit about this. And I'd like to just obviously set the scene for that before I go into the detail around what the enterprise standards are. So a really key thing in the new world is that we need to build supply chains that are robust, which means supply chains that can last a long time, are socially aware, environmentally responsible, and still contribute to business profitability. So what you'll see quite a lot of in the last couple of years is companies going green. And typically they'll do things that go green, but also contribute to cost reductions. So looking at things like solar panels on the roof of warehouses and things like that, which obviously also has a financial benefit. But we want to go beyond that and say, well, let's do things that are socially aware, environmentally responsible, independently, but also ultimately contribute to the business profitability. So I'd like you, if you can, to take out your phones or go onto your web browser. You'll see at the top there's a link that you could go into. It is, you can't see it there, polev.com/ASCM. And I'd like you to answer the question for me. What is supply chain sustainability? So let me give you a minute or two just to go into that and to see if you can answer that question for me. Let's see what kind of responses we get from the audience. If there's anyone out there. You might need to put your name in, but we won't be tracking names.
Is everybody able to access that?
Yeah, it just takes a bit of time to get through.
Okay. All right, let's see what responses we get back. They don't have to be long responses, just a couple of words, maybe a quick sentence. Yeah, it should be there. Can everybody join? Can everybody get through onto that link? Tanya, can you access that?
Yeah, it's working fine, Grant. I'm in.
Okay, perfect.
We're all diligently muting ourselves.
Right, thank you. Concentrating on answering the question.
Yeah, I'd rather chat than answer the question.
There we go. People are there. All right. So being conscientious of impact to environment and society. Conscious of impact to environment and society. Sustainable sourcing, green transport, and stakeholder engagement to achieve environmental targets. Business now and in the future. Okay. Good. So definitely the environmental piece coming through in the first two there. The robustness coming on the third one. The ability to withstand disruption, that's a really good one if we link that into the risk related to sustainability. Creating supply and value chain that is conscious of its impact on the environment. The focus on building companies that care about these social, environmental, and financial aspects of their supply chains. Okay, great. Ensuring sufficient stock availability at all times is sustainability. That's true. And then socially responsible supply chain. Okay, excellent. All right, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next piece here. So thank you for that. So what I do see here is two very, very key themes coming through. And the one is the responsibility from an environmental point of view, and the other one is the impact on society, or the ethics piece that we would call it from a sustainability point of view. So I think that does show that there is kind of a really good understanding overall of the fact that sustainability is not just about going green, it's about all these other aspects as well. If you could carry on in your web browser, you should have this question coming up now. So in your organization, which of the following bottom lines are most important to your long-term business success? And you can only choose one. So it'll be interesting to see which one of these, obviously, everyone is going to choose. Okay, some people are saying people, profitability. Okay, the planet is also quite important, not that important in the overall scheme of things. Okay, excellent. All right, we're getting there, all right. Okay, so definitely it looks like profitability is coming out as the most important bottom line when you look at business success, the long-term business success. And of course, looking at the people that would enable that. No one, however, said planet, which obviously falls by the wayside, I think, in many cases. Okay, great. Thank you for that. So this is really interesting to note. And I think it is ultimately right in saying that profitability would be a key long-term enabler to business success. But obviously all these other pieces need to be in place for it to be working well. And ultimately what we'd want to do is actually have this pie chart evenly spread amongst people, planet, and profitability. So if you could choose all three, we'd hope that everybody would choose all three of these. All right, so what I'd like to do is just to set the scene a little bit. And this is typically what I would do, not in so much detail, but if I go to like a Brian a weekend, right, which we haven't been able to do in the last 4 months, but I'm hoping we could get there again one day. The typical Joburg question is, oh, so hi, what do you do? And I have to explain the whole process of supply chain management and what it is, and that it's not just warehousing, etc. Right? And usually I'll try and explain it through some kind of method, like simplified method related to this. So this is a typical supply chain, right? And you all would have seen this really, really clearly. This is kind of logistics 101, right? So we've got the raw materials, obviously in the very beginning, moving into a supplier or someone who's converting those raw materials. We have a manufacturer, we have distribution, in this case, a retailer. It's always a physical retailer, but in this case, we could see that there. And then obviously, ultimately to the consumer. So when we look at the flows within supply chain management, there are a number of different flows. And this is how I always try and explain supply chain management to people outside of the industry. The first one is the flow of products or the flow of stuff, right? Typically that flow goes from left to right, all the way from the raw material through all the pieces of the channel into the consumer. We also mentioned there products and stuff, because stuff could be things like what's called MRO, maintenance, repair and operations, which are products that you would potentially need for repairs, for maintenance, for factories and things like that. And that's also something that needs to be planned within the supply chain. Interestingly enough, from a returns point of view, and that's why you can see this blue little arrow pointing back this way, is typically if you look at historically from a bricks and mortar point of view, you'll get between 5 and 8% of your products returned, right, through the supply chain from the end consumer typically. What we are seeing now, though, is there is a shift into more returns coming through with the rise of e-commerce. In e-commerce, and I actually tried to verify a few of these numbers, it's up to 30% of products that are returned through e-commerce. And that's a really interesting thing. So what that means is that there's much more emphasis that needs to be placed on products that need to be returned from a supply chain point of view, and that return element that you will know within SCORE. And then also things like when we look at the environmental aspect that's coming through as well, product life cycle management, things like batteries or globes, stuff that you could potentially return into the supply chain, and that can be reused, right? Plastic reuse is a good example of that. So we are seeing that return leg becoming more and more important, and also the supply chain and forecasting elements that are related to that return piece. The next flow that we have is the flow of revenue or profit, right? And typically you will see that that goes from right to left. Okay, so the consumers have the money and they're basically paying for all the products that are coming into them, and everyone in the chain is paying their suppliers and suppliers. There's obviously a focus on revenue, which is really, really big, and profitability we know is, one of the key drivers within supply chain management. And I remember actually, if I think back to about 2 or 3 years ago, there was an advert that was on TV. It was ShopRite. And ShopRite had said, well, we have saved you, the consumer, 5% on all your products. And basically what they were doing is boasting about how they had really constrained the suppliers and the manufacturers to not making any more additional profits so that they could push that back into the consumer, right? Which obviously means the manufacturers lost out in that piece. Okay. Then we have the flow of cost. So the cost is not really a flow per se, but it's definitely pieces within the supply chain that are contributing to additional costs, right? And by cost, I mean financial cost, right? And this is really typically what we would do in a network analysis type project, looking at the cost involved in all these different pieces within that supply chain. Usually the biggest cost that is related to, if you think of this in a holistic way, is cost of goods sold, so the cost of the product or the COGS. Labor cost comes out as really big as well. And then obviously you have key supply chain costs, right? Like the transportation cost, warehousing, duties, etc. So all of those pieces that we need to take care of. The next piece that we have here is the flow of information, right? And this piece is often forgotten when thinking about supply chain management. The flow of information really is about how do we manage the triggers from a consumer point of view. If we look at the forecasts, for example, all the way through that supply chain to ensure that we are accurately managing that entire supply chain network. So really, if we really want to get this right, we have to improve the forecast accuracy that we have. And also the data pieces that exist within the supply chain. You may have heard of a concept called the bullwhip effect. That's really about every piece in the chain holding additional inventory in anticipation of some additional demand. But what if you could give visibility of, for example, the manufacturer into what the consumer would potentially want, right? So that kind of information flow is really important in terms of making the right decisions and planning ahead. So those are typically supply chain management aspects, right? But now we want to add in something new to this. what about the environmental cost? And the environmental cost applicable at all levels of that supply chain. Really what's important to really understand here is which of these areas in the supply chain is contributing the most to the environmental cost. And when I say environmental cost, we could look at things like emissions, so looking at like carbon emissions, for example, looking at water and waste, looking at hazardous materials, etc., plastic consumption, and all of those kind of things. And I'd like to ask a question to the audience. I mean, someone maybe want to answer this, is where in this chain do you think is currently, if you look at overall supply chains, the biggest contributor to environmental impact? If anyone could guess an answer at that, which one of these pieces in the chain would you believe is the biggest contributor to environmental impact? Anyone answer that question? You can just put up your hand, I think, on the Zoom, and Tanya, if you could just have a look for me and see if there's anyone that's willing to answer that.
Let me unmute myself. We have got a few here. We have got carbon emission flow, distribution, manufacturing, consumer, waste at the end of the chain, consumer, distribution, products, logistics, environmental costs.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I'm glad to hear those answers, because it's exactly what I expected. Manufacturer and consumer come out quite a lot, right? So consumer waste in terms of, plastic consumption, packaging, that kind of stuff. Manufacturer, you would think of a factory producing carbon emissions. But unfortunately, none of those answers were correct. Where we really see a massive impact on the environment is in the raw material side. And let me give you an example. If you think of burger production, so I know this is going to sound silly, but hamburgers, right? The methane gas that's produced by the cows that are sitting in the farm is higher than the gases that are produced from a manufacturing point of view. I know it's very difficult to believe, but it is true. Also, if you look at the raw material side, the amount of water that is used on farms, for example, to produce raw materials, if you look at those numbers, it is massive, right? And I looked at a stat, and I'm not going to show it to you right now, but when we send out this presentation, I can definitely attach it. But it's very interesting to note that it was 22,000 gallons, which translates to about 5,000 liters per burger patty that is produced, right? So that is the water consumption that is used when you're looking at things like raw materials, and specifically around the meat production supply chain. So a massive, massive impact there. And yes, we should be looking at all places within the supply chain in terms of reducing that environmental cost. But really, the biggest issue is coming from the raw materials, surprisingly. The next piece that we have here, and the final piece, is the ethical cost, right? So what is the ethical cost involved in all of these places within the supply chain? Some elements that we may want to consider here is displacement of people and communities. We could look at the cost of corruption, for example. Comes up very strongly if you look at the relationship between a customer and a supplier. Those things are really, really real things, and we know that's all too well in South Africa as well. But those are all the costs that are related to this. So this is then the extended supply chain. And if I ever go to a BRI again, I'm going to explain it like this so that everybody is aware of all the complexities around supply chain management and the additional pieces that we now have to think about as well. All right, then if we look at this from a metrics point of view, and it's really important to show that all these elements are measurable. You cannot manage something that you can't measure. So it's really important that we have to assign measurements to each of these places within the supply chain and where they fit in correctly. So I'll give you a few examples of measurements that we would typically take, and you will know this very well as supply chain practitioners. Under the products or the stuff element, right, in terms of that flow. On time in full, OTIF, we've all heard about that. Perfect order fulfillment is another one that I believe everybody should be measuring. Perfect order fulfillment, just so that everyone is aware of what that covers. There's actually 4 elements of perfect order fulfillment. It's the on time in full, so it's the right product at the right time. It's at the right quality of product, and also with the right documentation, because you cannot receive an order if it doesn't have the right documentation. So that's obviously really important when measuring perfect order fulfillment. Looking at things like inventory, production plan adherence, manufacturing efficiencies, etc. These are the kind of things that we find within the products or stuff element, or the typical supply chain thinking. Then if we look at revenue and profit, as well as financial cost, of course, these come out. So the revenue, the cost of goods, and then specific supply chain or logistics costs that we may incur. Information is related to the forecast accuracy generally, data accuracy and the availability of that data. Environmental costs can be measured within things like carbon emissions, waste production, the waste composition, what it's made up of, as well as how we handle hazardous material and the disposal thereof. We can even measure ethical cost. So, for example, human life and injury. This is something that a lot of manufacturing sites already obviously do. Number of deaths in the last couple of days, or how many days since the last injury, etc. in a manufacturing environment. Then we have training and skilling of people. So, how skilled have we as an organization made our people? Have we given them something that they can take away? Compensation, and there's always a big debate about compensation from a CEO/executive level point of view, all the way down to your lower levels in the organization, where you have a massive disconnect between the compensation of various places. This is also very true when we look at things like production, supply chains or suppliers in other countries, where you have a very low cost of labor, and the fairness and ethics around that. And obviously then community impact. So there are many, many examples of community impact that we could look at here. One example that comes up that I think about a lot actually is there's an Australian mining company that is looking at developing a huge piece of land in the Eastern Cape for mining purposes. But what they will do is displace people that live there, the villagers, etc., that live in those areas. Then another important overlay, which we cannot ever forget about, is risk factors. So some examples of risks that we could come across is company reputation and consumer perception risk. That cannot be overemphasized, right? Once that perception of your company is tarnished, it's definitely a very long process to get that back to normal again. An example that I have on this is, we did a project last year in Brazil. It was for an oil and gas company. And it was also the first company that went through the ASCM-Enterprise certification. And they had a huge corruption scandal a number of years ago. It was in 2014. And if you look at the perception that still exists to this day of that company, even though they have put those people behind bars and there's been many solutions that have been provided to actually prevent anything like that from happening again, they still have that reputation which has been damaged, right? So it's a huge risk. Civil unrest is another big one. This raw material supply shortages, typically the most commonly cited risk that comes up, but usually that is because of other factors that have influenced it. Climate related and product safety, right? Disease and infestation, also quite a big risk, but unfortunately no one actually had this on their risk matrix, and now we find ourselves in the situation we're in. So, I didn't anticipate it either, but it's obviously one of those things. And then just as a reminder, how do we look at risk, and what is the calculation to really understand risk? So we are going to find this really clear. I think if you work in the supply chain area, is the likelihood of that risk happening versus the impact that it will happen, and impact if it does happen, right? And typically you'd want to try and create that impact in a metricized way. So any of these kind of metrics that sit up here on the top level is how do we show the risk or represent that risk with these metrics in mind. So what is the impact on revenue, etc., for all of these? Okay. Tanya, are there any questions that are coming up? If there's anything, just let me know.
I don't see any specific questions coming up. If anybody has a question right now, you want to pop up your hand before we move on?
Yeah. I think ask the question rather than type it.
Okay.
It's a bit-
There was a question from Karabo earlier on. Do we know what is driving that increase in reverse logistics / returns?
Well, from an e-commerce point of view, and I can give you that based on the facts that are out there, is what you see people doing is because there's very little risk in terms of sending a shipment back. So usually someone will come and pick it up from you, right? Again, you may see returns, and typically what people do is, if you look at clothing, for example, they will actually order 3 sizes of clothing and try them all on, and then send the ones that don't fit back. So that is something that happens quite a lot in e-commerce space. Another thing that's driving the returns, that returns piece, if I go back there for a second, is the environmental impact or the environmental awareness that people now have. So there's a lot more opportunities that are coming up now for return of a plastic bottle, for example, or globes that may be returned from if you have a lighting company, for example. And that is really a real case study where companies are doing this, right? They almost like renting out the light bulb and then returning it once you're done with it, and they just recycle it. So you're getting a lot of that kind of recycling that's coming through now.
I have another one here for you, Grant. If approximately 30% of e-commerce sales are returned through the supply chain, then it is safe to assume that some products are being packaged more than once, i.e. packaging waste, raw materials, plastic, cardboard, etc. Do you believe that this industry is conscious of this and have acknowledged such waste?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question, and packaging is one of the areas from an environmental cost point of view that comes up a lot. There are many companies that are actually looking at it. The ones that I've come across, they typically have a metric somewhere, looking at the amount of packaging that they use. But I think there's sometimes a disconnect between the root cause and the corrective action, right? So we're measuring these things and kind of know about them, but in terms of putting initiatives in place to reduce that packaging or reduce the impact we're having, I think there's a lot more opportunity for companies to actually go and to look at that a bit more. Okay.
Does that address your question there, Mo? Coming to guess. Yes, carry on, Grant.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So let's move on to the supply chain sustainability motivators. All right. So why do we want to be sustainable? Okay. So there are a number of reasons, and this is just a few of the reasons. The first one is we want to establish a visible competitive advantage in our industry. So there has to be that self-awareness and the mindset of continuous improvement, right? And the New Horizon is looking at environmental and ethical issues for continuous improvement. Also, what's really, really key at the moment is demonstrating transparency. So you do see this coming through now, where products that are sitting on the shelves of supermarkets are starting to put things in like, okay, this is a green source product, this is something that has come from an organic farm, not that it's necessarily greener, but that kind of awareness is coming out more and more. In some cases, you even see a product label saying this product traveled X number of kilometers and produced a carbon emission of X, right? So you do see that kind of transparency coming through, and consumers are demanding that more and more. The other one is ensuring suppliers align to the organization's values. This is a really key one. So in the past, you would say, okay, well, our supplier is going to supply us with, let's use a good example, Nike shoes, right? Somewhere in China. The problem with that is you know nothing about that factory. You don't know what they're doing, the labor practices, the ethics, etc. that's happening in that factory. What we need to be doing now is actually extending the ethics and the social responsibility of the organization into their suppliers as well. Okay. The other one is managing accountability to ethical standards. So, we can't just say, let's be ethical. We have to find a way or mechanism to manage that better. Embracing the culture of social responsibility. Obviously, it's very, very clear. Organizations can't ignore anymore the problems that surround them, the problems in the communities, etc. It's just become one of those things that's like not acceptable anymore, right? and showcase supply chain excellence. There's plenty of opportunities within the green space and the ethical space to showcase that excellence. And then long-term business robustness and profitability, obviously, right? So that one would kind of be the most, and what most people had put on that chart earlier, actually is one of the key drivers. So under the ensure suppliers align with organizations' values, this is a very big opportunity, particularly when we look at the sustainability initiatives, to bring those through into the suppliers as well. And then obviously, as we mentioned now, the long-term business robustness and profitability, that's something that we can never ignore, right? We know that that's key to any business survival. And then, as you mentioned, the public want transparency. You know, they want to know that the companies that they're buying stuff from are employing the best practice methodologies, and that they're actually doing stuff that is good for the environment, and that's, you know, not going to be a negative impact on any of the communities that they work in, right? Okay. All right, so let's have a look at the enterprise standards for sustainability then. So this is how the framework was set up, right? There's a number of frameworks that exist, plenty of frameworks and kind of guiding principles and things like that when we look at ethics and green issues. Dow Jones Sustainability Index, OECD guidance for multinational enterprises. And I'm not going to go through the details of this now from a time perspective, but all of these are focused on slightly different things, but really with the intention of providing either a framework or methodology for companies to determine how to measure or how to go about being green or being ethical and all those kind of things, right? It kind of provides standards. Interesting thing though, what I noticed about all the logos is that all the logos have some sort of global earth on them, which is really interesting to note, right? That was unintentional. Okay. So the enterprise standards also include the supply chain ASCM or APEX body of knowledge, which includes CPIM, CSCP, CLTD, and of course the SCORE framework. If you haven't got any one of those certifications, you should definitely send SAPEX an email immediately to get yourself on one of those certifications, because obviously any one of those is very good for all supply chain professionals. So the ASCM-Enterprise certification is really a culmination drawing from many of these aspects, as well as looking at, you know, other industry thought leaders and really getting their inputs into that sort of enterprise certification. Okay. So what are the enterprise certification standards? Okay, so it's a framework that organizations can use to evaluate supply chains across the dimensions of ethics, economics, and ecology. What is it used for in organizations? It's used to validate and update your supply chain strategy and link in those triple bottom line elements to help identify gaps for supply chain continuous improvement. So that's a really key one. And what we found in doing some of these analyses is that actually provides the client with some kind of view of where their gaps are amongst all these things, right? So it's not just the process gap or the economic type gap, but it's, okay, where are our gaps ethically and where are our gaps ecologically, and how could we potentially improve on those things? It also is an unbiased tool, which can help to validate the supplier quality, development, and or selection. So there's a very heavy focus on suppliers and supplier management within this framework, because it's such an important part when we look at any of these aspects to the business success. So it measures three things: social responsibility, economic sustainability, and ecological stewardship. And it empowers organizations to obviously reach their goals from a financial point of view, to be more efficient, right? To improve the results and to remain competitive, of course. So that is a high-level view of what the certification standards are. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask the questions in the chat box. Okay, so this is what it looks like. If I can give you a visual of the enterprise, ASCM-Enterprise. So I kind of think of it like an egg timer, where you can like shift it around and you know, put it in the place where you want it to be. But really it's all these layers that exist. In the middle there, you can see those typical supply chain processes and results. That's coming from the SCORE framework: plan, source, make, deliver, return. Then we have the dial around that, which is the three dimensions, right? The ethical, economic, and ecological dimension. So if you were to think of this, how could you make sure that the plan is ethical, right, in nature? And how would you then do that, right? So then the next step is the enablement, which is that light gray layer, the strategy, governance, workforce, technology, and knowledge. Those pieces need to be enabled to ensure that we actually can do these things. And then at the very outside of this, we have the stakeholder layer, obviously being key, the suppliers, the customers, the community, and obviously the government, all the pieces that an organization would typically interact with. Okay. So to give you an overview of kind of like what's included in each of these areas, and there is a lot. In total, there are 65 criteria that exist in the whole framework. And each of these has a lot of detail within them, which I will show you an example of in a moment. So within that layer, looking at the key supply chain process and results, you can see there's a number of aspects: facility master planning, lean planning, supply network planning. If we go down a little bit, you'll see supplier research, responsible sourcing, sustainable sourcing, supplier diversity. And these are aspects that are actually very closely related into the SCORE model at the moment, right? But they have got that, that ecological, economic, and ethical overlay on top of them. Okay, so that's what typically sits in there. And getting these things right, these types of processes, obviously contributes to business results and business success. We then have this layer, the ethical, ecological, and economic layer. And these are the kind of things we need to be thinking about in each of these layers, right? Under ethical, anti-corruption, antitrust, codes of conduct, confidentiality, human rights, labor practices, intellectual property, responsible marketing, and sales engagement, right? If we look at under ecological, circular economy, which is a concept that's we're hearing more and more about, climate strategy, energy, water, waste, material usage, and product life cycle stewardship. Product life cycle stewardship and circular economy are two very interesting pieces of the puzzle. And really they kind of almost emerging practices from a point of view of looking at how could we reuse or use waste that is coming out of one part of the supply chain or a different supply chain and make that into something useful somewhere else. Or also look at how do we recycle things that consumers have used and bring them back into the supply chain instead of going and producing more and polluting more potentially. So interesting concepts there. If we had a whole day, I could actually go through all of these with you. Then the next one is the enablement layer. So these are the kind of things that fit in that layer: the strategy, governance, workforce, technology, and knowledge. All those pieces that fit into there. And you'll see very interesting ones that obviously, this methodology or this framework has not left out anything. So far, I cannot find a concept that is missing out of this framework, right? So it's really comprehensive. So things like diversity and inclusion is included there, empowerment, learning and development, health and safety, risk management, all those pieces of the puzzle which need to be in here. Okay. And then we have the outer layer, which is the stakeholder layer, looking at the impact on the community, customers, government, and suppliers. Sorry about the picture on the government there. I'll make it more locally relevant next time. All right. Are there any questions about this so far?
Just, Grant, do you know whether green score is still a valuable methodology to use for practitioners?
Yeah, so green score is obviously included within the current score. So version 13 or version 12, I think. We'll have that. You'll have some links into that green score piece. Yes, it is, and some of what was taken into this framework was taken out of what was in green score, right? The intention is ultimately, from an ASCM point of view, is to use now, the ASCM-Enterprise standards, which will replace ultimately like green score and things like that, because it brings in a much more holistic view of all that kind of methodology and concept, right? Green score aimed to provide metrics in a lot of cases around environmental issues or environmental impact. But those are all encompassed here within the ASCM-Enterprise standards.
Perfect, thank you. I think that answers the question, Grant.
Okay. All right, so let me give you an example of what you would find if you actually went into the enterprise standards. So this is a page looking at specifically supplier diversity and development, which is one of the criteria. You can see that it's got standards, it's got evidence, metrics, and then key questions. So the standards would be, what standards should you as a company adhere to, right? If you look within that supplier diversity and development, it says that first standard there is the organization must be able to provide a supplier sourcing process that is impartial to all possible suppliers and not discriminatory based on prejudices, right? So there's one of the standards. If you look at the evidence piece over there, that second arrow on the left, diversity in workplace tracking document, including an external stakeholder analysis would be a piece of evidence that you could use to say, are we doing this piece? Supplier scorecard and audit results, another one. Supplier selection process overview and assessment criteria document. So how do we assess the suppliers that we bring in? Supplier diversity and development is really about bringing in a diverse set of suppliers, and particularly around SMMEs, so small, medium, and micro enterprises, which would be part of your supplier base. And typically this is something that is a good practice to do. We've also got the metrics there. So an example of a metric here would be percent of small, medium, or micro enterprise suppliers in your supply base. So this is a way to measure all of these pieces. And then what is also encompassed within the standards is some key questions. So do you have a sourcing or bid strategy for the potential inclusion of SMMEs in your supply base, for example, right? So this is how you would go about assessing an organization in terms of, to what degree do we meet these standards, and to what degree have we covered this particular piece, right? Okay. All right. So really from an application point of view, the standards is an unbiased tool to validate supply quality, development, and or selection. Obviously to help identify gaps as well when we look at that supplier selection, when we look at anything within the supply chain. Validate and update supply chain strategy and operationalize your sustainability plan. Okay, and here's an example of some kind of output that you may see coming out of this. The one on the left is the certification outputs. So if you look at this, it's just a view of, for those internal processes and results, to what degree does your organization meet these standards, right? And it's not at the moment a comparison between another company and the company that's going through the certification, but ultimately I think the plan would be to create some sort of benchmarking within this. But immediately you'd be able to see where we're strong and where we're weak, right? Then from an application point of view on the maturity survey, anyone can go and do this maturity survey, and I would encourage everybody to go ahead and do this for yourselves. It's really a self-assessment, right? So nothing that you're going to be putting into the survey is really based on checking of evidence, but you would be able to say, okay, where do I fit within this? And it's a really good first step to take if you're interested in taking this journey, or even if you just want to, see where you sit in amongst all of this, right? So, enterprise standards for sustainability, what do you do next? Okay, so here are some steps that you could take, right? The first one is download the ASCM-Enterprise standard set. It's free if you go to the ASCM website. The link is sitting over there on the slide. Secondly, fill out that maturity self-assessment, then you can kind of get a feel for where you would sit as an organization across all these different dimensions. And the third thing is contact Chainnovation to set up a no obligation opportunity discussion based on your maturity assessment survey. So once you have filled out that maturity assessment survey, we would be more than happy to have a conversation with you in terms of, what it means, where the gaps are, and what potential next steps there could be, based on that output, right? There's an entire process that exists from a certification point of view as well. We don't have time to go through that today. The intention was to really just give you an overview of, first of all, building the need for that sustainability thinking, and then how you could practically implement it using the ASCM-Enterprise standards. And I hope that you got the sense of that, right? So, are there any further questions before we close up this session? I think we're making good time here.
Good time. Okay. No questions. I don't see anybody. Oh, wait. Liesel? Are you waving your hand or clapping?
I'm waving my hand because I'd rather ask the question than type it out.
Okay.
I just want to ask Grant a question. So there's a lot of sort of sentiment about now that COVID's hit, companies are focusing on surviving and profit. So there is a danger of sustainability falling by the wayside because it's not seen as something that can help companies get through it. Although I disagree with that mindset, but there is that as a real issue. And the whole idea around building back better and building back greener and leaner, so to speak. I just wanted to know your views on that for chatting to companies about that.
No, absolutely. And I think from a financial point of view, companies may be reluctant to, do a full scale assessment and things like that. But it's not an and, it's an or, right? So when we look at, as you mentioned rightly, so ethics, environment, and economics are all within the same, the same zone, right? They should all be focused on, because it's not about making profit at the expense of something else. And I think that's in the past, if we look at the old paradigm, what companies have done, right? The Industrial Revolution made it that way, where you would just produce as much as possible, and really not looking at the impact that one has on other places, right, or other communities or the environment, etc. I don't believe that it's a concept that would fall by the wayside, even during this time, because companies are aware, the majority of the time, that there's a robustness that they need to build into their supply chains. And we know that by impacting the community negatively, ultimately impacts us, right? So I think there's much more of an awareness now than there has ever been before in terms of doing these kind of things. I mean, if I were to compare now the kind of, even during this pandemic, the kind of thinking around these things, it probably still is higher than we would have had 25 years ago. So there's definitely this, it's still there, still needs to be discussed, and I think it still needs to be on our radars, because we will come out of this, and we can't have a destroyed planet, once we come out of this. So it is an opportunity to think differently and to incorporate this into our future plans.
I agree. Tanya, can I be greedy and ask one more question on all the others?
No, you may go ahead.
Sorry, Grant. Just one more question, and it's kind of something that I've been struggling with, even being a sustainability sort of professional in the supply chain industry, is that companies don't often look holistically at their supply chains when they evaluate their footprints. It's quite a mindset now. It's more like, okay, well, I'm only doing the transport, so I'm just looking at the transport, or I'm only doing the warehousing, so I'm just going to focus on that. But I think the holistic picture, as you illustrated earlier, paints a much broader viewpoint. How do we get businesses to start looking at it holistically? And maybe there's people in the audience that maybe want to comment on that. But I don't think you're ever going to get a full understanding if you don't look at it holistically.
Yeah. And to just set that scene a little bit more, Liesl, is the product lifecycle stewardship is typically where companies could go about doing that and looking at all those pieces within the supply chain and say, okay, there was an example, I can't remember the exact case study for it, but there was a manufacturing company and they made bottles for a consumer good, right? And the debate was, do we want to make it in glass or do we want to make it in plastic? And one would immediately think, oh, no, glass is better because glass has a lower impact on the environment. But by looking at that holistically and looking at the entire supply chain all the way until consumer use and disposal of that, the cost involved, the transportation, the weight of those things, they actually made a plastic bottle, right? And I'll try to find that case study for you if you want. But that was a really interesting thing for me because they looked at it holistically, and when they looked at it holistically, they found that had a lower impact on the environment and most likely also a lower impact on the overall cost. And that's what supply chain management is. It's about looking at that holistic view and not just focusing on warehousing, transportation, distribution, etc. as one thing. It needs to be an engaged system, and that works exactly the same way when we think of ecological and ethical issues as well.
Great, thanks, Grant.
Grant, thank you so much. I know Grant's on quite a tight schedule here. He's in great demand. But I would really encourage all of you to take the assessment. encourage your clients, if you're consultants, to take the assessment. I think that there is not enough being done about sustainability. I know there's a lot of work being done, and I know there's a lot of talk about it. My concern is, are we actually practicing what we preach? And I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. So yes, we certainly need to elevate that, but this is a great tool. It's very helpful, and if you've got any questions, you'd like to tap into more information, we'll share Grant's email with you when we send out the post-event survey. The presentation has been recorded. We'll share that with you. And we'll also share the link for the ASCM assessment. So thank you for being here, for joining us this afternoon. I hope the session was valuable. And Grant, thank you for your time. And
thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you to all the audience as well. Absolutely. If there are any questions or anything additional that you would like to know about this, more than happy to take it further and to discuss it with you. But thank you so much for everybody's time and for the questions as well.
Thank you, Grant. Thanks so much.
Good.